This presentation, titled Risk-Based Auditing, comes to us from Shibu Davies. Shibu currently leads the certification and auditing business unit of TÜV Middle East, a member of the TÜV Nord Group in the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC. He is a senior assessor of ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and ISO 45001/OSIS 18001. In addition, Shibu is a senior trainer for these schemes under IRCA. He has represented various technical work groups and steering committees in the auditing and certification segment. He is presently the technical advisor for Emirates International Accreditation Center. His experience includes consulting, training, and auditing in various industry segments across the GCC. He is quite well known as a speaker in the region in the segment and has a technical YouTube channel with the title Dr. ISO. And with that, take it away, Shibu.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. So today's presentation, which I'm going to do, is on risk-based auditing. Why I selected this topic called risk-based auditing is this is one of the challenge which most of the auditors of management system facing nowadays, especially during internal audit and external audit. Basically, I will go through some definition. Then we will see why risk-based auditing is important. We will see a model of risk management because that will give some intro. Then how to consider risk and manage them in a risk-based audit. This is where I'll be focusing more time. Fine. To start with the definition, the simple ISO definition, an audit considering the risk. That means you are conducting an audit, but you need to consider that, look, the process of audit itself has a risk, and the audit you're conducting the system on has a risk. Now, where you need to take care, where the influence is happening, it is happening in the planning stage, in the conduct of audit, and in the reporting stage. Now, why it is so important? Because if you see the standard which any auditor should follow for a management system is 19011. There was a revision on 2018, and the most important change or the significant change they incorporated was approach towards risk-based auditing. Then another key reason is the business, an auditor should be business focused. As you all know that the business consists of various risks, and so the audit. So the auditor should consider these in his audits. Now, the question comes, why risk-based audit is important? As you all know, the base standard or the framework for developing any management system is based on Annex SL. I'll use the pen option so it will be more comfortable here. So here, if you see Annex SL, this is the standard or the framework standard based on which most of the ISO standards has been developed, the management system standards naturally. The standard Annex SL, it is demanding risk-based approach. So every standard is developed considering the risk. The next requirement, why risk-based audit is important, is based, as I discussed earlier, the 19011, which is the guideline for auditing MS, demands risk-based approach. Finally, all business are now on a highly risky environment. So it is very critical for an auditor to perform the audit considering the risks. Now, let's see a good model of risk management. From where does it start in an organization? Important that you need to have a context in an organization on managing the risk. The next phase is to identify what are the various processes in the organization, and for each process, what are the various activities. Now, for each activity, there could be a risk. So you need to look into each activity, process, activity. In each activity, you need to look for the risk. Now, when you look for the risk, you need to consider two factors. There are risks which are internally driven from the organization. There are risks which are driven externally to the organization. So you look into the process, divide them into activity, and look into each activity and see what are the internal risks and what are the risks coming from outside. But again, how? You need to consider strategic risk of this activity, financial risk involved in the activity, operational risk involved in the activity, and the general hazardous risk. Now, you finished your identification and analysis of the risk. Now you need to evaluate the risk. How do you evaluate the risk? Risk is evaluated based on the probability of happening such a situation. How probable is it happen? And if it happens, how significant it is? And based on the probability and significance, you need to evaluate. Is this risk low, medium, or high? Based on the probability and significance. Now, once you identify the probability and severity, once you evaluate your risk, then you need to apply the management of the risk. How can you manage a risk? First step is to avoid the risk. Can we remove the risk? As an example, you are doing a particular activity. Can this activity be eliminated so that risk is not there? Remove the source of the risk. Can it be done? Can I reduce the probability of the risk? Can I change the severity of the risk? Can I share the risk? Or I go with the risk but with various other controls. So by such management, you can control the risk. So how does the risk management happens? Identify the process, identify the activity, identify the risk, evaluate the risk, apply control. This is how the risk management model works. So basically an internal auditor or an external auditor, they should be well trained on the risk management principle. This is the responsibility of the organization who is implementing the management system, or the organization which is appointing third-party auditors to train them on this risk management models. Yeah. So now let's move to the next element. Now, as I said earlier, to plan, conduct, report, you need to manage the risk. Now, in audit program, you should consider how you will manage the risk. When you identify the resources, you need to consider how you will manage the risk. How you will ensure you have the right competent people and you have the right competent methods. We will see these two in the next slide more detailed. Now, in the planning, how do you determine, evaluate, and implement actions related to risk in an audit program? The first step, what we need to do is, when you do the planning, first check what is the extent of the audit. For what duration do I need to do the audit? What are the various locations of audit? Why it is important? Then you can plan your audit well. As an example, if you need to audit an organization which has 3 locations situated 150 kilometers away, so you need to plan what time shall I take, allocate for traveling from a location to another, so that I can spend the right time in the organization to do an audit. I should consider my travel time. Otherwise, what can happen? You may have to spend time from your auditing time to the travel, which will reduce the audit time and the result will be impacted. Now, you need to also consider which location am I going to do the audit. Maybe the location you are planning to do the audit need a security access. Maybe you need to apply it in advance. So all this should be considered in your audit planning process. Now comes the auditing. Do I have a competent auditor? This is the most important thing. The competence, as you know, is quite little. I mean, it's defined in terms of education, training, experience, and skill. Does he has the right education, training, skills, and experience to the audit of that process? Does he know the risk management principle? Does he know the specific sector of this industry? You need to study this so that you eliminate any risk during the audit. Now, do I have the right team? Do you think they will work as a strong team? All this you need to study and ensure that you have the right one in place. Now, then comes, do we have the right information to plan the audit? Do we have the right mechanism for record management of the audit process? This must be again considered when you plan an audit. Now, do you have the right resources? Very good example nowadays. Nowadays, you know that most of the audits are done remotely. Does the auditor has the right network? Does he has the right video conferencing techniques? Does the auditee has the right network? Does he has access to the video conferencing techniques? Can we exchange data during the audit? If the audit needs video survey, does the auditee has such a facility available? So you need to consider this again in your plan. Then, of course, you need to communicate your audit plans and outcomes, how you will be communicating, and you should have a clear plan on this. And again, you need a clear monitoring mechanism on your audit planning, performance, conduct, and reporting. So these are the things which you need to consider when you plan for a particular audit. Now, as you can see here, for planning, the team should have access to the risk identified and how they are addressed. As an auditor, I'm going to audit a particular organization. Before the audit, I should have access to the risk identified for this organization and how these risks are identified in the organization. It's not that I go there and find these risks and how they are addressed. I should have access to this before. I should go through this risk. You can see in the next stage, review the documents. For what? To see what are the risks in this organization, how these are addressed in this organization. Why? Because I need to consider this in my risk-based approach. I also need to consider the risk of my auditing activities. I need to consider, is there any risk in achieving my objectives of the audit? Based on the identified risks and how they are addressed in the organization, I need to allocate my auditors. I need to ensure, according to the expertise of auditors, I need to allocate them to the organization. I also, when I plan, need to consider, am I going to create any risk to the audit team during the conduct of the audit? So this is the next point which I should take into the picture. Now, during the conduct of the audit, what I should take care? During the opening meeting, I should explain to the client regarding my risk-based approach, because it is very important to make it very transparent to the client that, look, this is the way I'm going to audit because I'm taking the risk-based approach. So I'll be doing the activities as follows. It should be very clear to the audit team. And of course, again, any significant risk identified during the audit should be reported immediately. If I identify any significant risk in the audit process or in the organization which was not identified, must be reported immediately. This is one of the requirements, or this is something which you need to take care of. Now, any change or new risk identified during the audit, again, we should report it during the audit. Now, status of the risk of the organization. That means an organization would have identified the risk, they have implemented, they evaluated, they identified the significance, they applied the controls. Where do they stand? This must be reported to the organization. Whether it is quality management, environmental management, or safety management, or any other standard. What are the risks related to that? What have they implemented? Where is the status of this implementation? This must be reported to the organization. This is one of the requirements of the audit. And finally, during the closing meeting, or the status of the risk and the actions taken must be addressed. So you see, starting, you need to brief about your risk-based auditing approach. Any risk identified during the audit, which is new, must be reported immediately, the significant ones. And you need to take note of all the status, and it must be reported during the final, the reporting of the audit. And in the closing meeting, you need to give the status again to the management. This is one of the requirement. And again, it is explicitly addressed in clause 6 of ISO 19011, which is the standard for auditing. Now, let's go to the most important element, which is the competence of the auditors. You see here what is mentioned: strong knowledge on risk-based auditing approach. Very, very, very challenging question. Why? What I have seen in the recent days or in the last 2-3 years, many of the auditors are the classical auditors who has done various audits in the last 5-10 years. They just can go conduct an audit based on the standard, finish the audit, come out. Whether it's external or internal. The question is that, have they been trained on the risk management approach? Have they been trained on the 19011 requirements on risk management or risk-based approach? It's a very challenging question. Many are trained, many are not trained. So it is very important for an organization to ensure their internal auditors are trained on risk-based approach and risk management. Also, the external certification bodies, they have to ensure their auditors are trained on risk management and risk-based approach. Now, the second critical element, strong understanding on the risk associated with the industry audited. This is another big challenge. Is that an auditor audit any type of industrial sector? I don't think so. With this risk-based approach, it's possible. Why? The auditor should have knowledge on the risk related to their industry. What could be the risk? What could be the significant ones? What are the control mechanisms? How these controls can be implemented? This knowledge must be there in auditor. Maybe I'm coming from a mechanical industry. I know a mechanical workshop. I know their welding process. I know the risk related to the welding. I know what type of controls can be done and how this can be implemented. Not necessarily I'm an expert in a hospital. The risks are entirely different. So when you plan an audit, you need to ensure the auditor is someone who knows the risk related to the industry he is going to audit. He has an experience on the industry sector. He has the knowledge on the processes. This is very critical when you identify an auditor for a specific audit. Then comes calibrated to the current and future business risk trends. The risk in 2019 is different to 2020, as we all know. Now, a classical example, COVID-19. When we were doing audits in 2019, we never looked into something like COVID-19. I mean, the risk associated with that. But now the things changed. Is the auditor trained on such risk and controls mechanism? Are they indebted to the local regulations on that, on such things? Are they indebted to the international good practices on that? This is only an example, yeah. Same way, an auditor must be calibrated according to the trend in the industry on the risk and the controls associated with that. Auditor must be calibrated to the legal regulations on the risk, legal regulation on the controls. A risk related to environment or safety and the regulation related to environment and safety, it changes. In different countries, it changes in different frequencies. The auditor must be calibrated to the new requirements. This is one of the key factors. Now, the auditor must be trained on the 19,011 requirement. As you saw in the earlier slides, here the auditor should have a knowledge on the risk management tool. He should know how to do the audit considering these factors which we discussed. And he should know how to do an opening meeting. He should know what to identify and report, and he should know how to do a closing meeting. Such awareness must be given to an auditor. He must be trained on these 19,011 requirements. Mainly, you can see the clause number 7 is talking about it. Clause number 6 talking about it. And you can see again clause number 6. So he must be indebted or trained on these requirements. Yeah. So we go to the next part. So as you saw earlier, that during an audit, the audit team shall review the entire system and process. For what? Whether the risks are identified, determined, and addressed. Whether the risks are identified, determined, and addressed. Now, how shall they do? This should be done along with the system and process audit, not standalone. It's not that you finish your quality part, then you walk into a process and say, can I see your risk? No, when you go into a process, you check the compliance. In the same process, you look into the activity, you look into the risk, you look into the evaluation of the risk, you look into the control. So an auditor should do a process auditor, and at the same time, during the process audit, he should check, see whether the organization has identified, determined, and addressed the risk and its control. But again, to perform the above, the audit team shall have the competence in risk-based approach, which we discussed earlier. Fine. With this, I came to the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your patience and listening to this one. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shibu Davies, for that look at risk-based auditing. And that concludes this presentation.